The desert was quiet that morning. The air was dry and the wind carried the faint smell of dust and sagebrush. In the shade of a tall oak tree, a man sat motionless. His head leaned slightly to one side, his right hand still holding a Colt .45 revolver. His name was Johnny Ringo, once feared across the American frontier. But now he was just another body found in the wilderness. A single gunshot wound marked his temple. His boots were still on, and his horse was nowhere to be seen. The date was July 13th, 1882, deep in the Chiricahua Mountains of Arizona. That day the legend of Johnny Ringo came to an end. Or perhaps it truly began. Johnny Ringo had always been a man of mystery, half outlaw, half philosopher. Some called him the fastest gun in the West. Others said he was a killer haunted by his own past. But few truly knew the man behind the legend, a quiet soul who read poetry, quoted Latin, and carried more pain than pride. To understand the story of Johnny Ringo, we have to go back, far before the gunfights, before the fame, before Tombstone. Back to the day his innocence died. It was 1856, and the Ringo family was traveling west. They had left their small home in Green Fork, Indiana, searching for a better life in Texas. Johnny was only 6 years old, a curious, bright-eyed boy who loved stories and dreamed of adventure. The journey was long and harsh. The wagons creaked. The horses grew thin. The dust never seemed to settle. But the real tragedy came one afternoon when the family stopped to rest. Johnny's father, Martin Ringo, took his shotgun from the wagon to check for bandits along the trail. As he pulled it toward him, the trigger caught on the wagon wheel. Bang! The blast echoed across the open field. Martin fell backward, his head torn apart by the force of the shot. Johnny saw it all. His mother screamed. His sisters cried, and the boy stood frozen, staring at his father's lifeless body. That single moment carved a scar so deep it would shape the rest of his life. Years later, people would describe Johnny Ringo as cold, distant, even cruel. But maybe he wasn't born that way. Maybe he was just the boy from Indiana who watched the world turn cruel first. After his father's death, the Ringo family tried to rebuild their lives in Texas Hill Country, near the small town of Mason. Johnny grew tall, quiet, and quick with his hands. He was smart, smarter than most men around him. He could read and write when few others could. But under that calm face, something dark was growing. In his early 20s, Ringo found himself caught in the middle of a local war, the Mason County War, also known as the Hoodoo War. It started as a dispute between German settlers and American ranchers, but it quickly turned bloody. Cattle theft, revenge killings, and shootouts filled the streets. Johnny chose a side, and it wasn't the laws. He fought for his friends, and soon his name began to spread. People said Ringo had ice in his veins. He never shouted, never flinched, never missed. When he pulled his gun, he did it like a man flicking away a fly. Calm, effortless, deadly, but each kill seemed to pull him further into the darkness. By 1875, the war was over. Ringo was wanted for murder. He rode west again, leaving behind a trail of graves and a heart full of ghosts. He drifted from Texas to New Mexico, then to Arizona, a land where the law was thin and legends were thick. Everywhere he went, stories followed him. Some said he was a gentleman, polite, soft-spoken, even charming. Others swore he was a cold-blooded killer who drank too much and cared too little. The truth lay somewhere in between. In the town of Tombstone, Arizona, Ringo found his stage. It was a place boiling with greed, whiskey, and gunpowder, a town ruled by silver and sin. Lawmen like Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, and Doc Holliday tried to bring order, but the outlaws, the cowboys, had their own rules. Ringo joined them, not because he wanted riches or fame, but because he belonged nowhere else. He became their quiet leader, respected and feared. Even Wyatt Earp admitted, Ringo was the best man with a gun I ever saw, but inside, Johnny Ringo was crumbling. He drank heavily, often disappearing into the desert for days. Locals would find him talking to himself, quoting Shakespeare, or staring into the fire with tears in his eyes. The boy who once dreamed of adventure had become a man running from his own mind. Every death he'd seen, and every life he'd taken, echoed in his head like the blast of his father's shotgun. And so, when they found him dead beneath that oak tree in 1882, the question was not how he died. But why? Some said it was suicide. Others whispered that Doc Holliday or Wyatt Earp killed him for revenge. There were rumors of a drunken accident, a robbery gone wrong, even divine punishment. But perhaps the truth is simpler and sadder. Perhaps Johnny Ringo died the way he lived, alone, misunderstood, and haunted by ghosts that no one else could see. Johnny Ringo's story is not just about bullets and blood. It's about a man torn between the light and the dark, a man who could quote poetry one minute and draw his gun the next, a man who carried his father's death like a shadow that never left his side, and though his life ended under a tree in the Arizona desert, his legend never truly died. It rode on, through books, movies, and whispers of the Old West. Johnny Ringo, the haunted gunslinger, remains a reminder that even the fastest gun can't escape the past. The sun burned hot over the Texas hill country, and the dust rose from the horses' hooves like smoke from a fire. It was the summer of 1875, and the town of Mason, Texas, was about to drown in blood. This was where Johnny Ringo's name would first be whispered with fear, a quiet man with cold eyes, caught in a war that no one would truly win. Johnny had been living in Mason County for a few years. He was in his mid-20s, tall, lean, and calm like still water before a storm. He worked as a ranch hand, broke horses, and tried to build a life far from the ghosts of his childhood. But trouble was coming. And this time Johnny would not be able to walk away. The trouble started small, just missing cattle. German settlers in the area claimed that American ranchers were stealing their cows. The ranchers, in turn, said the Germans were fencing land that didn't belong to them. It was a simple dispute at first, until pride, anger, and guns got involved. And then came the lynching. A group of German settlers captured a man named Tim Williamson, a friend of Ringo's. They accused him of cattle theft. He begged to be taken to court. Instead, they shot him dead and hung his body from a tree as a warning. That was the day Johnny Ringo changed. He had seen death before, his father's, and plenty more on the frontier. But this time it was different. This time it was personal. Johnny swore vengeance. He joined forces with a rancher named Scott Cooley, a former Texas Ranger who had been like a son to Williamson. Together they gathered a group of men who wanted justice, or revenge. And just like that, the Mason County War began. The newspapers called it the Hoodoo War. Locals called it hell. The first few weeks were filled with retaliation killings. Men disappeared in the night. Bodies were found in rivers, wells, and shallow graves. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Johnny Ringo was no longer the quiet cowboy. He had become a gunman. He rode hard, shot fast, and never looked back. Some said he killed with precision, one shot clean and final. Others said he killed without feeling, like he was numb to everything except the sound of his revolver. But deep down, maybe Ringo wasn't driven by hate. Maybe he was driven by grief, by the same dark fire that had been burning inside him since that day his father fell. In the chaos of the feud, Ringo's reputation grew. People said he was fearless, that he could stand face to face with death and never blink. Some claimed he read the Bible at night. Others said he read Shakespeare, whispering lines about fate and betrayal as the war raged on. He wasn't just another outlaw. He was something else, a man caught between right and wrong, reason and rage. One night, near the Llano River, Ringo and Cooley's men surrounded a cabin where a group of German settlers had taken refuge. Gunfire lit up the dark. Bullets tore through the wood. When it was over, the cabin was silent, and the war had taken more lives. Ringo didn't celebrate. He just stared into the flames as the cabin burned, the fire flickering in his cold blue eyes. Maybe he knew, even then, that this path would only lead to ruin. By the end of 1876, the Texas Rangers had moved in. Most of Cooley's men were dead, captured, or on the run. Johnny Ringo was one of the few left standing. He was arrested for murder and thrown into jail in Burnett, Texas. Locals came to stare at him, the famous gunslinger who barely spoke. Even behind bars, he had a strange kind of calm, as if he knew that no cell could truly hold him. And they were right. One night, Ringo and a few others managed to escape. No one knows exactly how. Some said the guards were bribed. Others said Ringo simply vanished into the Texas night. Either way, he was gone, riding west into the vast unknown, a wanted man with nothing left but his gun and his ghosts. The Mason County War had changed him forever. It had taken away the last bit of innocence he had left. From that moment on, Johnny Ringo would never again try to be just another cowboy. He was now part of the outlaw world, a place where law and morality blurred like heat waves on the desert road. But unlike most outlaws, Ringo carried something different, an intelligence, a quiet sadness, a depth that made even other gunmen uneasy. He could talk about death as calmly as he could quote poetry. He could drink with thieves, then ride alone into the desert to stare at the stars. He was both man and myth, and soon the world would learn his name. By the late 1870s, Ringo had crossed into New Mexico and then Arizona. He drifted from town to town, Bisbee, Galeyville, Tombstone, always just ahead of the law. Some said he was hiding. Others said he was searching, for peace, or maybe for a place to die. He found neither. But he did find the Cowboys, the most dangerous gang in the Arizona Territory, and he fit right in. In those wild lands, Johnny Ringo's legend only grew. He was not loud like the others. He didn't brag, didn't show off, didn't need to. People simply knew. When Ringo walked into a room, silence followed. Men avoided his stare. Women whispered his name. And even the toughest outlaws treated him with a strange kind of respect. He was no longer just Johnny Ringo, the ranch hand. He was Johnny Ringo, the gunslinger, the man who could quote Latin one minute and end your life the next. But behind those cold blue eyes, the storm still raged. He carried the weight of every man he'd killed, every friend he'd lost, every mistake he couldn't undo. The war had ended, but the war inside him never would, and as the road led him toward Tombstone, the most dangerous town in the West, fate was waiting for him once again. The road stretched, endless across the Arizona desert, red dust swirling behind the hooves of a lone rider. The sun burned hot on his back, and the wind whispered his name. Johnny Ringo, once he had been a cowboy, then a fighter. Now he was something else, a man on the run from the law and from himself. Every mile he rode took him farther from his past, yet somehow closer to his fate. After escaping jail in Texas, Ringo drifted through the borderlands for years. He crossed into New Mexico, where the law was thin and the whiskey strong. He gambled, drank, and made a living with his gun. Sometimes he protected stagecoaches. Sometimes he robbed them. It all depended on who was paying. He was good at surviving. Too good. No matter how far he rode, he always seemed to outlast danger. But survival isn't the same as living. And deep down, Johnny Ringo was tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being a ghost in his own story. In the late 1870s, the frontier was changing fast. Railroads were spreading. Towns were growing. Civilization was creeping west, but it came with greed and corruption. There was one place, though, that still belonged to outlaws. A place where silver glittered in the rocks and bullets settled arguments. That place was Tombstone, Arizona, and for Johnny Ringo, it would become both his stage and his grave. Tombstone was unlike any town in the West. It was alive, loud, dangerous, and full of men who wanted everything right now. Silver miners, gamblers, thieves, and drifters filled the streets. Gunfire was so common that locals joked it was the town's official language, and at the heart of it all stood two rival forces: the lawmen, led by Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and the cowboys, a gang of rough riders, smugglers, and killers who ruled the countryside. When Johnny Ringo rode into Tombstone, he didn't take sides right away. He watched, listened, and learned, like a wolf studying a new pack. The cowboys were not a single gang, more like a brotherhood of men who lived outside the law. They smuggled cattle from Mexico, robbed stagecoaches, and partied hard. Names like Curly Bill Brocious, Ike Clanton, and Billy Clanton carried both fear and fame. When Ringo met them, they saw more than another gunman. They saw a leader, quiet, intelligent, and deadly. Ringo wasn't loud like Curly Bill or reckless like Ike Clanton. He was calm, calculating, and when he spoke, people listened. Soon he became one of the most respected men among the cowboys, but not because he bragged or bullied. Because he didn't have to. People in Tombstone noticed him right away. He wore fine clothes, often dressed in black. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. Some nights, he sat in the Oriental Saloon, sipping whiskey and quoting Shakespeare to stunned cowhands. "I'm not what I seem," He once told a friend, "I'm just a man trying to forget what I've done." But there was one man he couldn't ignore: Doc Holliday. Holliday was everything Ringo wasn't: loud, sarcastic, and quick to start a fight. He was a gambler and a killer, but also a man dying of tuberculosis. Both men were dangerous. Both were brilliant. And both seemed to recognize something familiar in each other: pain. Their first meeting in Tombstone became the stuff of legend. They traded insults in Latin, yes, Latin, stunning the crowd that had gathered to watch. It wasn't just a duel of guns. It was a duel of minds. No one drew that day, but from then on, everyone knew if Ringo and Holliday ever faced off, only one would walk away. Despite the tension, Ringo tried to keep peace in Tombstone, at least for a while. He was tired of pointless bloodshed. He even tried to calm the wild tempers of the cowboys, urging them not to provoke the Earps. But the West had no room for peacekeepers. The more Ringo tried to hold the cowboys together, the more they spun out of control. Drunken shootouts, ambushes, and robberies pushed Tombstone closer to chaos. And then came the spark: the gunfight at the OK Corral. It was October 26, 1881. Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, along with Doc Holliday, faced off against Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it changed the West forever. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys were dead. The Earps became heroes to some, villains to others. And Johnny Ringo, though he hadn't been there, suddenly found himself on the wrong side of history. After the gunfight, the cowboys wanted revenge. Ringo was seen as their new leader, a man smart enough to challenge the Earps and cold enough to finish the job. Rumors spread that he was planning to kill Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday himself, but Ringo wasn't interested in revenge. He was tired, restless, and slipping deeper into depression. He drank more, spoke less, and wandered the desert for days at a time. Some said he was losing his mind. Others said he was trying to find God. Whatever he was searching for, he never found it. By early 1882, Tombstone had become a graveyard for dreams. The cowboys were scattered. The Earps were wounded, bitter, and hunted. And Johnny Ringo, the quiet, intelligent outlaw, was fading away. He once told a friend, "This life, it's like a card game you can't win. The longer you play, the more you lose." Soon, he would fold his hand for good. As he rode away from Tombstone, no one knew it would be the last time anyone saw Johnny Ringo alive. He rode alone, as he always had, into the desolate mountains of Arizona, where the silence was deep enough to swallow a man whole. The story of his death was still months away, but the legend of the haunted gunslinger was already written in dust and blood. Tombstone was changing. The silver boom had made it rich, but greed and blood were draining it dry. Lawmen and outlaws walked the same streets, drank in the same saloons, and watched each other with cold eyes. And in the middle of that fragile peace stood 2 men, Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday, bound not by friendship, but by something darker. They were enemies, and in a strange way, reflections of each other. Johnny Ringo had built a reputation that stretched across the frontier. He was calm, deadly, and strangely thoughtful, a man who read books in the same hand that drew his gun. Doc Holliday, on the other hand, was loud, sharp-tongued, and dying. A gambler, a killer, and a man who used words like bullets, quick, precise, and meant to hurt. They should never have crossed paths. But in Tombstone, everyone's paths eventually crossed. It happened one evening at the Oriental Saloon, a place filled with cigar smoke, laughter, and danger. The piano played softly as miners and cowboys drowned their troubles in cheap whiskey. At the far end of the bar, Doc Holliday was dealing cards, his thin face pale from illness, but his eyes bright with mischief. When Johnny Ringo walked in, the noise seemed to fade. His boots clicked against the wooden floor. His hand rested lightly near his revolver. He didn't need to say who he was. Everyone already knew. He moved with a quiet confidence that made even the toughest men turn away. Doc looked up and smiled. "Why, if it isn't the great Johnny Ringo," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ringo didn't smile. He looked at Doc for a long moment before answering softly, "I heard you were some kind of legend, Holliday." "I came to see for myself." The room went silent. 2 of the deadliest men in the West, standing face to face, every muscle ready, every eye watching. Then, Instead of reaching for their guns, they began speaking in Latin. Words rolled off their tongues like music no one else understood. The gamblers and cowboys stared in confusion. Doc smirked. Ringo tilted his head. To everyone else, it looked like two geniuses arguing in a dead language. But to the men who knew them, it was something far more dangerous, a verbal duel between predators. When the conversation ended, Doc raised his glass and said, "In vino veritas," in wine. "There is truth." Ringo's reply was calm and cold. "Age quod agis." Do what you are doing. The meaning was clear. Keep your hands steady. And finish what you start. Doc's smile faded. For a second, his fingers twitched near his gun. But then he laughed, and the tension broke. No one died that night. But everyone in Tombstone knew one day, one of them would. From that night on, Ringo and Holiday were like two storms circling the same sky. They never forgot each other. They didn't need to fight. Their rivalry lived in every glance, every rumor, every whispered story. Some said they hated each other. Others said they understood each other better than anyone else ever could. Both were intelligent, both were dangerous, and both were doomed. As the months passed, Tombstone streets ran red. The gunfight at the OK Corral had changed everything. The cowboys wanted revenge. The Earps wanted justice, and Ringo was caught in between. He was tired of the killing, but he couldn't escape it. Everywhere he went, people expected him to lead the cowboys. But Ringo wasn't a leader anymore. He was a man slipping deeper into despair. He drank constantly. Some nights he'd sit in the saloon until dawn, staring into his glass, mumbling to himself. Other nights he'd ride out alone into the desert, talking to the stars. There were times when he seemed almost normal again, sharp, charming, and funny. Then, without warning, the darkness would return. Friends said he talked about death more and more. He told one man, "I don't fear dying. I fear living without purpose." It was as if Ringo knew his story was nearing its end. Doc Holliday wasn't doing much better. His lungs were failing, his body wasting away, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. He heard the whispers that Johnny Ringo was coming for him, and he welcomed it. "If Ringo wants to dance," Doc said one night, "I'll lead." The two men almost met again in early 1882. Some say they stood just feet apart at a ranch near the San Simon Valley. Others say it never happened. Either way, the legend grew. Two gunslingers, destined to face each other, like fate itself, holding its breath. But fate had other plans. Ringo was unraveling. His friends tried to keep him from drinking himself to death. They failed. He stopped shaving, stopped sleeping. His letters grew strange, full of regret, sadness, and poetry. Even Doc Holliday, for all his sarcasm, seemed to pity him. Once, when asked about Ringo, he said softly, "He's the most dangerous man I ever met, because he's already dead inside." By the summer of 1882, the rivalry had lost its fire. The cowboys were falling apart, and Ringo had lost everything: his friends, his gang, his peace of mind. He was a ghost in his own life. Doc left Tombstone soon after. He would die a few years later, coughing blood in a Colorado hotel. But Ringo's end would come first. Sudden, silent, and shrouded in mystery. Their duel never happened. But maybe in a way it did. Not with bullets, but with souls. Two broken men on opposite sides of the same mirror, each haunted by the other's reflection. And when Johnny Ringo finally vanished into the Arizona hills that summer, Doc Holliday's words would echo forever. I guess it's true what they say. Every man's got his reckoning. The year was 1882. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, painting the land in gold and blood. The wind carried the whisper of a name, Johnny Ringo, a name that once made men flinch and women turn away. But now even the wind seemed to pity him. The legend of the gunfighter was fading. The cowboys were scattered. Tombstone was quiet. And Ringo was lost. He had spent years fighting other men. Now he was fighting himself. In the saloons of Galeyville and Tombstone, people still talked about him, the tall man in black with cold eyes and a sharper mind than most. But those who had known him best said something had changed. He no longer laughed. He no longer smiled. He just drank. Every day began and ended with whiskey. It dulled the pain, blurred the memories, and numbed the guilt that clung to him like dust on his boots. When he wasn't drinking, he rode alone through the desert, endless miles of heat and silence. Some said he was looking for redemption. Others said he was looking for death. Maybe they were both right. At night, Ringo would sit by his campfire, staring into the flames as if they could burn away the ghosts of his past. He saw his father's face, the blood, the smoke, the horror of that childhood accident. He saw Tim Williamson, his murdered friend from the Mason County War. He saw every man he had shot down, every soul that had fallen because of his gun, and he would whisper to the fire, "I didn't mean for it to be like this." But the flames never answered. By now, Ringo was 32, young by most standards. But in the Old West, he was already an old man. The years had carved deep lines into his face. His hair had grown long and tangled. His clothes were worn, his boots cracked. Even his famous revolver hung loose at his side as if it had lost its purpose. He was no longer the proud gunslinger who commanded attention when he entered a room. He was just another broken soul the desert had claimed. Rumors spread fast in those days. Some said Wyatt Earp was hunting down the last of the cowboys. Others said Doc Holliday was sick and dying in Colorado. Ringo didn't care anymore. The world that had made him famous was falling apart, and he had nothing left to hold on to. He wrote letters to no one, rambled to strangers, and sometimes talked to himself. One witness said, Ringo rode through town with a bottle in one hand and a Bible in the other. Maybe that was true. Maybe that was just another story. But it fits the man he had become, a sinner begging for grace he didn't believe in. One night in July 1882, Ringo wandered into a small settlement near the Chiricahua Mountains. He was pale, thin, and trembling from drink. He ordered whiskey, then another, and another. When he couldn't pay, he traded his boots. The bartender said he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His hands shook. His voice was low. He muttered about death, about the devil, about how it all ends under a tree. No one stopped him when he left. They just watched him ride away into the mountains, barefoot on burning sand. For 2 days, he wandered alone. The desert was merciless. His horse grew weak, stumbling through the dry riverbeds. Ringo dismounted and walked beside it, whispering, "It's all right, old friend. We're almost there." But no one knows what there meant. On the morning of July 13th, 1882, a rancher named John Yost was riding through Turkey Creek Canyon when he saw something strange. A man was sitting beneath a large oak tree, his head bowed, a revolver hanging from one finger. At first, Yost thought he was asleep. Then he saw the blood. A single bullet hole marked his right temple. The gun had fired once. The bullet had exited through the back of his head. Johnny Ringo was dead. The coroner's report said he'd been drinking heavily for days. The bottle found near his body was nearly empty. His horse was nearby, still saddled, wandering in circles. The official verdict, suicide, but not everyone believed it. Some claimed Wyatt Earp had hunted him down. Others swore Doc Holliday had ridden from Colorado to finish what they'd started. Even today, no one knows for sure. All we know is that Johnny Ringo died alone, under the same sky he'd ridden beneath his whole life. His body was buried right there, beneath that oak tree in the Chiricahua Mountains. No priest, no prayers, no gun salute. Just a shallow grave and a wooden cross, but legends don't stay buried. Within weeks, stories spread. Tales of ghosts in the desert, of a man in black seen riding under the moonlight, of the sound of gunfire echoing where no one lived. People said it was Johnny Ringo's spirit, still searching for peace. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just the wind, carrying his story across the canyon walls. In life, Ringo had been both feared and admired. In death, he became something greater, a mystery. Was he a hero? A villain? A lost soul? Maybe he was all three. But one thing was certain. Johnny Ringo had become a symbol of the West itself, wild, tragic, and unforgettable. They say the desert doesn't remember names, but some names echo forever. And when the sun sets over the Chiricahua Mountains, when the wind rustles through the trees and the shadows stretch long, you can almost hear him whisper, "Every man's got his reckoning." The morning of July 13th, 1882, was like any other in the Chiricahua Mountains, hot, dry, and silent. But by noon, that silence would turn into legend. A rancher named John Yost was riding through Turkey Creek Canyon when he spotted something strange beneath an oak tree. At first he thought it was just another cowboy resting from the heat. But as he drew closer, he realized the man wasn't moving. The man was dead, his boots were off. A revolver dangled from his right hand. A single bullet hole marked his temple. It was Johnny Ringo. The coroner arrived 2 days later. The heat had already done its work. Flies buzzed in the air and the smell of death hung heavy. They examined the body and wrote down what they saw. Bullet wound to the right temple. Bullet exited the left side. Death instant. Body sitting upright against a tree. Next to him were his hat, his gun, and an empty whiskey bottle. The verdict, suicide. Case closed, or so they said. But the West loved its mysteries, and Johnny Ringo's death was one of its greatest. Almost as soon as the news spread, so did the doubts. People who knew Ringo well said the story didn't make sense. They said he was found barefoot with no tracks leading to where he sat. They said his gun was found hanging from his hand, an odd detail for a man who supposedly shot himself. Some even claimed there were 2 bullet holes, one in his temple and one at the back of his head. If that were true, it couldn't have been suicide. It had to be murder. One of the first rumors pointed to Wyatt Earp. By 1882, Wyatt had lost his brothers and had become a man obsessed with vengeance. He was said to be hunting down every cowboy who had ever crossed him. Some claimed that Wyatt tracked Ringo into the mountains and killed him under that tree, finishing what the OK Corral had started. It was the kind of story people wanted to believe, the hero outlasting the outlaw. But there was a problem. Wyatt Earp wasn't even in Arizona at the time. Records showed he was hundreds of miles away, hiding from the law himself. So if it wasn't Wyatt, could it have been Doc Holliday? That rumor was even juicier. Doc and Ringo had been rivals, enemies who respected each other too much to forget. When Ringo died, people whispered that Holliday had finally come to settle the score. One story claimed that Doc rode secretly from Colorado to Arizona, ambushed Ringo in the canyon, and left him dead beneath that oak tree. It sounded dramatic. It sounded cinematic, but it was impossible. Doc Holliday was in Denver that week, over 600 miles away. In fact, court records showed he was in front of a judge on the very day Ringo died. No fast horse in the world could make that trip in time. So if not Wyatt and not Doc, who? Some said it was Curly Bill Brocious, Ringo's old friend turned enemy. Others blamed Ike Clanton, claiming the two had fought over money or pride. But there was no proof, no witnesses, no tracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if the desert had swallowed the truth whole. And then there was the strangest theory of all, that Johnny Ringo had staged his own death. That he was tired of the killing, tired of the fame, and wanted to disappear. People swore they'd seen him years later, in Mexico, in Texas, even in California. A tall man with cold blue eyes and a quiet voice. A man who looked a lot like Johnny Ringo. But ghosts can be convincing. As the years passed, new evidence and old legends kept colliding. Historians re-examined the coroner's report, searching for clues. They found none that could truly solve it. The details remained hauntingly odd. His horse was found wandering with its saddle still on. His boots were off, neatly placed beside him. The bullet wound was precise, too clean, too deliberate. Some experts said that if Ringo had been drunk, he might have shot himself clumsily. Others argued that, even in his lowest moments, he was too proud, too controlled to die like that. Maybe he wasn't trying to kill himself. Maybe he was just cleaning his gun and made one fatal mistake, or maybe, just maybe, someone was waiting in the shadows. There's another version of the story, passed down quietly in Arizona for generations. It says that Johnny Ringo didn't die at the hands of Wyatt or Doc or any other outlaw. He died because of himself, but not from suicide in the way people think. According to this story, he had been drunk for days, delirious from heat and whiskey. He fell from his horse, the gun went off by accident, and the bullet struck him as he tried to stand. His hand froze on the grip. His body fell against the tree, and that's how they found him, upright with the weapon still in his grasp. A tragic accident, not a choice, not a murder. Just another lonely death in the unforgiving desert. But maybe that's why the story of Johnny Ringo refuses to die. It's not just about how he lived or how he shot. It's about how he ended, suddenly, mysteriously, and alone. Somewhere between fact and folklore, his death became a mirror for the Old West itself, a place where truth and legend were always riding side by side. Today, That oak tree still stands in the Chiricahua Mountains. There's a small wooden marker there, weathered by sun and time. It reads simply, Johnny Ringo, 1850, 1882, gunfighter, gentleman, mystery. And maybe that's all he ever wanted to be remembered as. Not a villain, not a hero, but a man whose story was too wild to ever be fully told. The desert forgets most names, but Johnny Ringo's, it remembers. It lingers in the air like gunsmoke, half real, half ghost. He died under a tree, but his story didn't die with him. It only began to grow, stretched, twisted, and retold until no one could tell where truth ended and legend began. After Ringo's death in 1882, word spread fast across the Arizona territory. Some called him an outlaw. Some called him a gentleman. Others said he was both, a killer with a poet's heart. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Johnny Ringo wasn't ordinary. He wasn't just another gunslinger. He was mysterious, educated, and coldly elegant, the kind of man people couldn't forget. And that's how the stories started. The first stories were simple, tales of his quick draw, his temper, his duels. But soon they became larger than life. In the saloons and mining camps of the West, cowboys told wild tales by lamplight, that Ringo once shot 6 men in a single fight, that he rode through a thunderstorm laughing at lightning, that he made peace with death long before he died. None of it could be proven. But that didn't matter. In the Old West, a good story was stronger than the truth. By the turn of the 20th century, the legend of Johnny Ringo had become a cornerstone of Wild West folklore. Writers, poets, and dime novel authors turned him into a myth, part hero, part villain. Some made him a heartless outlaw who lived for blood. Others painted him as a tragic figure, a man too intelligent for the brutal world he lived in. The real Ringo was gone, but his ghost had become immortal. Then came Hollywood. In the early Western films of the 1930s and 40s, Johnny Ringo appeared as the classic gunslinger, cold, fast, and doomed. But it wasn't until the late 20th century that he truly became famous again. In 1993, the movie Tombstone hit theaters. And with it, Johnny Ringo was reborn. Actor Michael Biehn played him as a deadly, poetic, almost spiritual villain, a man who could quote Latin before pulling the trigger. The film turned Ringo into the perfect opposite of Doc Holliday, played by Val Kilmer. 2 men haunted by death, circling each other like wolves. Their scenes crackled with tension, sharp words, sharper eyes, both men smiling through their pain. "All right, Lunger," Ringo says. "Let's do it." It was fiction, but it felt true. And in that moment, Johnny Ringo became one of the most unforgettable characters in Western cinema. But the movie only deepened the mystery. People began asking, who was the real Johnny Ringo? Was he really a villain? Was he really as dangerous or as sad as they made him out to be? Historians tried to answer, but the truth had been buried under a century of stories. Letters, diaries, and witness accounts all painted different pictures. To some, he was a cold-blooded killer. To others, he was a lonely, intelligent man destroyed by the world around him. Both versions felt true, because in a way, both were. Over time, Ringo's name became a symbol, not just for the man himself, but for everything the Wild West represented. He was the outlaw with a conscience, the killer who read poetry, the man who couldn't escape the ghosts in his own mind. Modern storytellers call that a contradiction. But back then, it made him a legend, because the West loved contradictions. It loved men who were both brave and broken, violent and vulnerable. Johnny Ringo was all of those things, and that's why his name still echoes today. Even now, people visit the spot where he died. A simple grave in Turkey Creek Canyon, shaded by oak trees, marked with stones and an old wooden sign. Visitors leave coins, whiskey bottles, and handwritten notes. Some write prayers, some write apologies, some just write his name, as if calling to him through time. It's strange how a man who died alone can still draw crowds more than a century later. But maybe that's the magic of legends. They make us see ourselves, the parts we hide, the battles we fight alone. Writers still argue about him. Was Johnny Ringo truly evil, or just a man who couldn't find peace? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He was both sinner and saint, hero and ghost. He lived in a world that didn't know how to make room for men like him. Too wild for civilization, too thoughtful for chaos, and that's what makes his story timeless, because everyone at some point knows what it feels like to fight a war inside their own head. Ringo's story has outlived almost every lawman, every outlaw, every saloon that ever stood in Tombstone. His name appears in history books, songs, documentaries, and even modern country music. He's been portrayed as a villain, a philosopher, a martyr, and a madman, sometimes all in the same scene. And still, no one knows for sure who the real Johnny Ringo was. Maybe that's why we keep telling his story. Because we're still searching for the answer. Because deep down, we see a little of him in ourselves. The battle between what we are and what we wish we could be. In the end, the legend of Johnny Ringo isn't just about a man who lived and died by the gun. It's about what comes after, how stories outlast people, how truth becomes myth and myth becomes memory. When the wind blows through the canyon and the moon rises over the desert, people still say they can hear spurs jingling softly, the echo of a man who refused to fade away. And maybe that's how Johnny Ringo wanted it. To live forever, not in life, but in story. Every legend begins as a person. Before the gunfights, before the fear, before the fame, Johnny Ringo was just a man. A man with thoughts, dreams, doubts, and demons like anyone else. But what made him unforgettable wasn't how fast he drew his gun. It was what was going on behind those cold blue eyes. People who met Johnny Ringo often said the same thing. He was different. He wasn't loud like most gunmen. He didn't brag about his kills or his reputation. He spoke softly with careful words, as if he was always thinking before he spoke. In the rough world of the Old West, that made him stand out. He could read. He could write. He could quote the Bible and Shakespeare. And in a time when most outlaws could barely sign their names, Johnny Ringo could hold a conversation that made people stop and listen. There was a certain charm about him, quiet, confident, dangerous. Women found him fascinating. Men feared him, but also respected him. One rancher said, "Ringo could look you in the eye, and you'd feel he already knew what you were going to say." He carried himself like a man who had lived many lives, and maybe, in a way he had. Johnny Ringo wasn't born to be a killer. He grew up a curious boy who loved stories and learning. But the frontier didn't reward kindness or curiosity. It rewarded survival, and survival for Ringo came with a gun. When he joined the Mason County War in Texas, he wasn't fighting for greed. He was fighting for loyalty, for justice, or at least what he thought justice meant. But somewhere along the way, he lost that part of himself that believed in right and wrong. The war hardened him. And once you've pulled the trigger enough times, it gets harder to remember why you started. Still, under the rough surface, there was something deeply human in him. Something that never quite died. He loved horses, he loved music, and he loved long silent rides at sunset. He often spoke of freedom, not as an outlaw, but as a man trying to escape the noise of his own thoughts. Friends said he was generous when sober, cruel when drunk, and silent when sad. And sadness, for Johnny Ringo, was a constant companion. One friend from Tombstone once described him like this: "Ringo had the kind of sadness that doesn't come from losing something. It comes from knowing you'll never find what you're looking for." That's what made him so hard to understand. He wasn't chasing money or power. He was chasing peace. And the cruel thing about the frontier was that peace was the one thing it never gave. Ringo's intelligence was both a gift and a curse. He could see the world more clearly than most men. He understood how fleeting life was, how every gunfight, every bottle, every choice could end it all in a blink. Maybe that's why he drank. Maybe the whiskey helped blur the edges of a world that was too sharp to live in sober. He wasn't afraid to die. He just didn't know how to live. Even when he joined the Cowboys, he never acted like a true outlaw. He followed rules, his own kind of code. He didn't kill for pleasure. He didn't rob the helpless. He didn't brag or boast. When others celebrated after a fight, Ringo would sit in silence, his eyes far away, as if haunted by what he'd done. One cowboy once asked him why he never smiled. Ringo answered softly, "Because I've seen too much to find it funny anymore." Those words stayed with the man for the rest of his life. Johnny Ringo wasn't just haunted by his past, he was haunted by his mind. He thought too deeply for a world that demanded simplicity. He carried guilt like a shadow, and when he looked around, all he saw were reminders of what he could never fix. Every man he'd killed, every friend he'd lost, Every sunrise that reminded him he had to keep going when he didn't want to. If you strip away the legend, what's left is a man who never fit anywhere. Too smart for the saloon. Too wild for the church. Too restless for peace. That's what made Johnny Ringo who he was. Not the gun, not the fame, not the fear he inspired, but the loneliness that lived inside him. He wasn't the villain of Tombstone. He wasn't even really an outlaw. He was just a man who couldn't find his place in a world that didn't understand him. In the years after his death, people painted him as a monster or a martyr. But those who knew him, the few who truly did, said something different. They said Johnny Ringo was sad, that he wanted to stop fighting, that he wanted to be free from everything, even from himself. And maybe that's why his story still matters today. Because Johnny Ringo reminds us that even the toughest-looking men can be breaking inside. That even the sharpest gunfighters can be fragile beneath their armor. That strength and pain often share the same face. If Johnny Ringo had been born in another time, a time with peace, not pistols, he might have been a teacher, a writer, maybe even a preacher. But he was born in the Wild West, where your fate was drawn faster than your gun. He didn't choose the world he lived in, but he tried to survive it the only way he knew how. And in that struggle, that fight between the man and the myth, Johnny Ringo became eternal. The desert has buried countless names. But more than a century after his death, one still rises from the dust, Johnny Ringo. He was gone by the age of 32. Yet his legend lives, stronger now than when he was alive. Not because he won great battles or ruled great lands, but because he embodied the one thing the West never forgot: mystery. When people speak of the Wild West, they speak of Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Billy the Kid, but Johnny Ringo stands apart. He wasn't a lawman or a rebel hero. He was something else, a quiet storm that left behind more questions than answers. And maybe that's why we remember him, because deep down we are drawn to mysteries, to stories that don't end cleanly, to lives that feel unfinished. After his death in 1882, the name Johnny Ringo began to spread across the frontier like a whisper. Old cowhands would tell stories of him around campfires, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Some said he could shoot faster than lightning. Others claimed he once spared a man who begged for his life, then rode away quoting scripture. Each storyteller added a little more, a twist here, a line there, until the truth was buried under layers of imagination. By the early 1900s, Johnny Ringo was no longer just a man. He was an idea. In dime novels, he became the thinking man's outlaw, a killer with conscience and a code. Writers loved him because he wasn't simple. He wasn't all bad or all good. He was gray, conflicted human. Readers couldn't get enough. The name Ringo became shorthand for mystery and danger, a symbol of the West's tragic beauty. Even those who'd never heard his true story knew the name. It rolled off the tongue easily. Johnny Ringo, strong, smooth, eternal. When Hollywood came calling, the legend only grew. In the 1950s, he became the subject of Western TV shows. Then came the films, dozens of them, each one reinventing him. Sometimes he was the villain, sometimes the misunderstood antihero, sometimes both at once. But it was 1993's Tombstone that sealed his place in popular culture. In that film, played by Michael Biehn, Johnny Ringo became more than just a gunfighter. He was poetic, intense, haunted. The showdown between him and Doc Holliday, played by Val Kilmer, became one of cinema's greatest moments. It was more than a duel. It was a meeting of souls. One line from the movie summed him up perfectly. "It appears my hypocrisy knows no bounds. A man aware of his flaws, yet unable to escape them. A man trapped between sin and salvation." That was Johnny Ringo. Since Tombstone, his name has appeared in songs, books, even video games. Musicians have written ballads about him. Historians have debated his death for decades. And tourists still visit his grave, tucked away in the Arizona hills. Some leave flowers. Some pour whiskey on the ground. Some just stand there in silence, staring at the spot where history and myth became one. It's not about whether he was a hero or a villain anymore. It's about what he represents, the eternal struggle between the man we are and the man we pretend to be. Johnny Ringo's story speaks to something universal. He wasn't fighting for gold or fame. He was fighting himself, his guilt, his loneliness, his regrets. And that's why his name has outlived the era that made him. We see ourselves in him, in his contradictions, his restlessness, his search for meaning. He reminds us that even the strongest men can be broken, and even the broken can be remembered forever. Historians still debate the truth. Was he really as dangerous as they said? Did he really kill as many men as the legends claim? Did he truly take his own life? The facts are lost to time. But maybe the facts aren't the point. Maybe what matters most is what his story makes us feel. When people hear the name Johnny Ringo, they don't think of dates and reports. They think of dust and silence, of a man sitting beneath a tree, revolver in hand, staring into the horizon. A symbol of what it means to live fast, love little, and die too soon. Today, that oak tree in the Chiricahua Mountains is more than just a gravesite. It's a monument to mystery, a reminder that some stories never die because they refuse to be simple. Johnny Ringo's story has been told in whispers and in songs, in black and white photos and in Technicolor films. But the truth, the real truth, still sleeps beneath the Arizona soil. Maybe that's how he wanted it, because Ringo didn't chase fame. He didn't want statues or songs. He just wanted peace, something the world never gave him in life. So in death, maybe he took it for himself. More than 140 years later, Johnny Ringo still rides through the imagination of everyone who hears his name. He's become a symbol of rebellion, of tragedy, of the cost of living fast and dying young. And yet his story carries a strange kind of comfort. It reminds us that even when life ends too soon, stories can last forever. The desert wind still moves through the oak branches above his grave, whispering softly. If you listen closely, you might hear it. Johnny Ringo, a name carried by time. A man turned into myth, and a legend that will never truly fade. The sun rises over the Chiricahua Mountains, spilling gold light across the desert. The wind moves softly through the oak trees. The world is quiet. And somewhere in that silence, the name Johnny Ringo still echoes, like a whisper carried by time. He's been gone for more than a century, yet the legend refuses to rest. Because Johnny Ringo was never just a gunslinger. He was something deeper. A man searching for peace in a world built on chaos. Every story that lives forever has one thing in common: truth hidden in pain. And Johnny Ringo's truth began long before the gunfights, before Tombstone, before the fame. It began with a boy who watched his father die by accident, and who carried that moment like a scar carved into his soul. He grew up trying to be strong, trying to be fearless, trying to become the man he thought the world demanded. But no amount of courage could ever silence the echo of that shotgun blast from his childhood. It followed him, into Texas, into the Mason County War, into the endless deserts of Arizona. And in the end, it followed him to the tree where he fell. The truth is, Johnny Ringo was always running, not from the law, not from his enemies, but from himself. He tried to drown his guilt in whiskey. He tried to hide it behind books and poetry. He tried to forget it in the sound of his gun, but the past doesn't forget. It waits. And one day, it catches up. That's what happened in the summer of 1882. After years of violence, loss, and loneliness, Johnny Ringo reached the end of the road, not because someone outdrew him, but because life had already taken everything worth fighting for when they found him. Sitting beneath that oak tree, people said he looked peaceful. No anger, no fear, no struggle. Just stillness. Maybe after all the storms, he finally found the quiet he had been chasing all his life. Some called it suicide. Others called it murder. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was surrender, not to weakness, but to fate. Because even the strongest men, when the world becomes too heavy, sometimes choose silence over survival. In the years that followed, Ringo's grave became more than a resting place. It became a story told over and over. In books, in songs, in movies, each version different, each one trying to make sense of a man who refused to be simple. Some made him a villain. Some made him a hero. But the truth sits quietly somewhere in between. Johnny Ringo was both light and dark, intelligent, kind, dangerous, and broken. He could quote scripture one moment and pull a trigger the next. He was a contradiction, and that's what made him unforgettable. In a world obsessed with heroes and villains, Johnny Ringo stood for something else, the tragedy of being human. He reminds us that no matter how far we run, We all face the ghosts of our past, that even the fiercest souls carry pain that no one sees, that sometimes the toughest battles are the ones fought in silence. And that's why, more than 100 years later, his name still carries power, not because of what he did, but because of what he was. A man, flawed, fragile, and real. In his own time, people feared him. Today, people mourn him. And maybe that's the greatest measure of a life, when fear turns into understanding, and understanding turns into respect. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West. He wasn't the most famous. But he was the one who made people feel. He made them question what made a man good or bad. He made them see that the line between the two is thinner than we think. In the end, Johnny Ringo's legacy isn't about gunfights or glory. It's about searching for peace, something we all do in our own way. He never found it in life, but maybe beneath that tree under the wide Arizona sky, he finally did. His story teaches us that legends aren't made from perfection. They're made from pain, loss, and the courage to keep moving, even when there's nowhere left to go. Today, when travelers stand at his grave, they don't see an outlaw. They see a symbol of freedom, of loneliness, of the endless struggle between man and destiny. The air there feels heavy, like it remembers. The wind still carries the scent of dust and whiskey. And sometimes when the sun begins to set and the desert turns gold, it's easy to imagine him. That tall, quiet figure in black, riding slow through the canyon one last time. No gun. No noise, just the sound of his horse and the whisper of the wind. As the final light fades behind the mountains, one thing becomes clear. Johnny Ringo never really died. He became part of the land, part of the myth that built the West. His story lives every time someone whispers his name, every time another storyteller tries to understand the man behind the legend. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, not to be remembered for killing or dying, but for living on his own terms. In the silence of the desert night, if you listen closely, you can almost hear him, a voice soft as wind, whispering through the canyon. Every man's got his reckoning. Mine just came early, and with that, the story of Johnny Ringo, the haunted gunslinger, the poet outlaw, the man who rode with ghosts, finally finds its peace.